So just a quick reminder, this session is also recorded. So for those who weren't able to join us in person, we will circulate the recording later. We will also have a small highlights video of the event. So we have had quite a packed and a long day, so we have reached one of the most crucial panels of the day, which is the banking one. And as we have heard from different parts of the system, from real estate to sustainable finance regulation and standardization, what we face is quite a diverse range of challenges, and banking in that sense is absolutely crucial because it's the lifeblood of the economy. This is the transmission mechanism for how you finance a lot of these things and a lot of the change that we need. And today we have the pleasure of a very unique panel, I would like to say, because we have some of the best experts from practice to academia working on these things, people who have championed sustainability across the region from very, very early days. Because I remember when I was starting ISFC in 2020, Piotr's name popped up immediately, and I was very happy to find that there was somebody in banking who was talking about it. And then Agnieszka working on the theoretical side and supervision, and she was one of the first experts we included in our special set of experts on sustainable finance for the CE. And it was fantastic to see that we found an entire, I think, 10 experts, and we were very happy, so thank you for joining that. We also have with us Gabriel Marosi from Erste Group, who leads the sustainability there from Vienna, which is an absolutely crucial actor. Erste Group is massive across the CE, and it's very interesting to hear what is happening in that space. And then we have Krzysztof Kamiński, who's joining us from the board of Millennium TFI, and who is also very, very interested in developing this topic in Poland. So I will also introduce Agnieszka's work as we go forward, and also Piotr's leadership as now part of PZU, but you were before with HSBC, is that correct?
Indeed, for 15 years.
For 15 years, wow, okay. Impressive, okay, right. Let's now dive in, and I think I'll start with you, Gabriel, if I may. So what are the key changes that you're seeing, since you've been also, like Piotr, in the space for a long time? I know that you have an upcoming publication soon, so it'd be very interesting to see what are the main changes you observe. And also, what are the changes that you're doing as a group internally? Because you have a lot of stuff and a lot of power, so it's always interesting to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, Alina, thank you very much, and thank you that we can be here. I think it's a really great event. I was following the discussions before, and many of the topics actually are very much resonating across the region. I see these are not just Poland issues, but also I see the completely same issues in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Austria even, and then down on the Balkan as well. So firstly, let me start as you started. We as bankers, we have a bias which normally, the people have in a limited manner, but I think that the bankers tend to believe that we are in the center of everything, right? We have the regulators, and on the other side the customers, we have the investors, and then on the society, and we have the depositors and the creditors, and in between there is a bank. And this is our perspective, so what we try to do is in some way, kind of navigate a reasonable sustainability transition. And the reasonability for me is very important, because it's even shown in one of the last publications from ECB that a kind of disruptive change would cause the biggest kind of loss in the banking sector. So what we need to do is in some way, raise the awareness, prepare the market. Also, we need to understand actually what is the transition pathway, what are the technologies available, which are those sectors on the market which are the kind of most prepared for the transition. And then setting up some pathway for ourselves, some kind of targets. Now, this is the most sensitive part of the whole exercise. Until you are building kind of knowledge, and until you are showing to the management graphs and raising kind of concept, is everything fine once you are coming with the targets, and the targets then needs to be translated into business measures, then it is coming much more tangible, and this is where I was very careful listening also the previous discussion on the real estate, because we just last year were working with 7 countries of us to understand how we can define a transition pathway, a kind of ambition of finance emission reductions until 2030, and how we can do it in a market-specific way. You know, how we can fill the data gaps. The data gaps were also a topic in the morning as I was following that discussion. And we need to come with the transition plan, which is kind of ambition enough to be but not overshooting the market possibilities, because banks cannot do this transition. We can just help to kind of achieve it, but ultimately the real economy need to make the investments, and they need to find also the motivation for the investments. So this is what we are doing on managing the portfolio. We started with the most important sectors, which is for us the real estate. This is clearly the biggest part of the balance sheet, and then the energy sector, which is the second most prepared sector for the transition. So for these 2 sectors, we were able to define net zero targets, and the same we are doing also for our operations. I mean, ultimately we are operating in 2,500 locations across 7 countries. So this is already a quite nice footprint, and on that one we were able to achieve also 60% reductions in the last 4 years. So that was an investment which we tried to do, and our ambition is to come to net zero by our operations in 2030. So that's, you know, just 8 years away, or 7 years already, and a lot of technology conversion still needs to happen. Maybe I would just, you know, give also a chance to the other panel speakers.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point that the real economy needs to make a shift. The banks can only do as much, as crucial as they are in the middle, as you said. Agnieszka, since you've been looking at banks for a very long time, and you're following also the international debate across Europe, and we're working together at the EUAC, at the Florence School of Banking and Finance, I would like to ask, do you actually have good examples of how banks are managing the risk or developing new green products from other countries? Are there some countries that are further advanced? I mean, always when we try to structure these panels, our first summit, we had Sylvie Goulart from Banque de France, we had Slepen from the Netherlands, and of course those were the kind of pioneers, and of course the Bank of England. And then actually, before we started in the green room, because that was a Zoom call, this was still during COVID, they all just admitted that, you know, yeah, we do a lot of research and we do a lot of work, but actually in terms of practice, you know, we're not there yet. So it'd be very interesting to hear what you've observed in terms of what changes and what are the best practices that you're seeing implemented.
Thanks so much, Linda, for the lovely invitation and for having me here. It's a fantastic opportunity also to bridge the academic and practical gaps, so thank you so much for this. When it comes to best practices, maybe it's easier to start with saying what are the worst practices, right? So there is definitely a lot of data out there collected by various NGOs in particular about what banks are getting wrong. So what are there's the Reclaim Finance ranking of the most heavily of the banks or financial institutions more broadly that finance the fossil fuels or what we know are essentially stranded assets, right? When it comes to the good practices, this gets a little bit more complicated and we need to get quite a bit more granular. So there are at least 4 areas where we can look for best practices, I think. So first of all, how banks assess the materiality of climate and environmental risks. So what are the internal procedures for them to identify this? Secondly, the type of risk management procedures they have in place. So whether it's just kind of saying we are not going to invest in coal, which is of course great, and it is a way of mitigating stranded assets risk. but you can ask whether there could be more constructive ones. So there are, of course, there's the alignment method, so you can look at how a bank tracks how it will decarbonize its balance sheet, so something that we've heard about just now, so the transition plans, and then different types of climate stress testing, which is now slowly being introduced by banks, but the thematic review of the ECB says it's just 25% of the banks that are doing this. So some further areas are things like strategy and commitments, so various fora where you can look up, for example, if your bank is signed up to the GFANs, so the Bankers for Net Zero initiative, whether it has a transition plan, and a transition plan means how a bank will decarbonize its balance sheet by 2050. It's a terribly complex and challenging exercise, which requires that the banks also develop some expectations about technological progress. So we have a lot of new initiatives now coming up, such as the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which helps financial institutions bridge this gap of knowledge about future. It's obviously not about predicting, but kind of managing the likelihood of different scenarios materializing. Fourth area is definitely the availability of sustainable finance products. So this is something that where the more advanced countries in sustainable finance by now are offering a lot of variety. In Poland, we are only now starting. The total green bond issuance in Poland is around 6 billion, and that's included 6 billion euro, and that's including the sovereign issuance since 2016. So very tiny compared to the market, which is over 400 billion in euro. But this introduction, with this introduction, I wanted to pivot a little bit to the supervisory best practices, because I think that's also very important. So I think most of the representatives of the public authorities are not here with us anymore, but nonetheless, maybe a little inspiration for things we can expect from public supervisors. And so the 4 areas of best practices I've mentioned build largely on ECB work in the area. And what the ECB has done, I think, is really fascinating for a scholar of regulatory and public policy practices, but it also has a lot of practical relevance, right? So what the ECB did was first start to consult, develop some expectations. In this context of uncertainty, clearly communicate what are the expectations vis-à-vis the market. We have a lot of reports coming from the ECB over the last 2 years showing best practices in the banks, showing progress. So ECB is not scared of saying the banks are not 100% perfect, right? This is not a secret. But with subsequent reports, the ECB is able to say, well, now banks used to have 50% of financial institutions used to have an adequate materiality assessment of CLE risks in 2021. Now it's 80%. So there's some progress with regard to internal procedures within the bank. So this kind of experimentation and joint building of solutions between public authorities and banks is definitely an best practice, something to think about. I think also pushing for new regulatory tools, right? So transition plans, prudential transition plans, is something that the ECB was really, I think you can say, strongly campaigning for, and now it's coming in, and it will affect Polish banks also, both by the virtue of the fact that a lot of subsidiaries in Poland are part of ECB supervised banks, but also because this will be an EU-based regulation. And just a final point here in this context of the ECB's kind of approach, kind of forward-looking guidance to regulatory requirements. What I think is really important is also the joint developing of tools. So we know what are the challenges. We know data, we know methodology, we know metrics. But what the EU's banking union supervisor engaged in really is in exercises which actively help banks bridge these gaps. So whether you are looking at micro-pro stress tests or macro-pro stress tests, climate scenario analysis, these are areas where the ECB is actively helping banks also close these gaps and saying, it's not collusion, it's between the supervisor and the supervised banks, but it's definitely kind of this joint effort and coordination, and that's something I'll come back to later.
Thank you. That's a very thorough answer. I love it. It's also 1, 2, 3, 4. I love numbering things, so I think that's brilliant. It's actually interesting that you pointed out about the different instruments. So we all have talked about green bonds, sustainable investing the whole day. And actually I would like to now turn to Krista. Because what we see, for example, we had a recent CFA survey, and I know that you are affiliated with CFA in Czech Republic, that said that the market's definitely really interested in sustainable finance products. So give us green bonds, give us green mortgages, very, very interested. Yet nothing's really much happening. And then, to be honest, part of that people complain about is that the central bank is not part of the network for greening the financial system. One of the only European banks that's not part of it, and is not unlikely to become a member anytime soon. So there's no market signals. So, however, Poland's a bit different. We don't have any NGFS membership here. So are you actually seeing changes in the market? Are investors interested in green products? Is there a demand side? Is there any demand pushing for it? And also, are you seeing this collaborative effort also in Poland in terms of supervised and supervisor dialogue?
It depends on the point of view, on the perspective, because I represent the asset management company that is tied to the banking group. So I look at the banking sector from the point of view of an institutional investor, and in this area I can observe the growing interest of and awareness of ESG aspects within the investment decision process. This is a consequence of the, I would say, a very significant change of the approach of the global and specifically European asset management industry. Within 2 years' time after SFDR introduction, more than over 50% of the total mutual funds assets moved into the green funds, so-called green funds, Article 8 mostly. But this was a kind of reclassification from one side, and the effect of the reclassification, but on the other side, growing interest of institutional investors, because they have been obliged by the SFDR to clearly communicate what they are going to do with their investment portfolios. And because it became a competitive tool for many asset managers to show up to clients, to other potential investors, institutional investors or asset owners, to attract them by the fact that they are greening the portfolios. What does it mean to green the portfolio? Of course, it's another story, but of course we need to be more transparent in our approach. We need to identify the risks of the issuers and investment products or investment capabilities that we have, and we have to clearly identify or build our strategy. What are the criteria of selection of particular investment instruments like bonds or equities? So we have the very good examples of companies like Robeco or Nordea that did this, and it drove the market to the level we have right now in Europe. And banks are on the other side of the story. They are on the, let's say, sell side of the story. because they have been obliged by SFDR and other regulations to also be an important capital transfer hub of the money to the green or more sustainable, responsible companies. But of course, they started to report, they started to adapt and make the transition plans, as we heard. And they are quite advanced, I would say, specifically the Polish banks. Most of them have either medium or quite high rankings in ESG scores, which is maybe surprising to the public. But anyway, they are on the level of average, at least, in European standards, because their capital mothers, the owners, have headquarters in Western Europe, like France or Spain. So the Polish banks are quite good prepared for the transition. But of course, it's a question of how they do it. They just made a evaluation of their portfolios from the climate risk perspective, make some classifications. They are adapting to EBA requirements, etc., etc. But this is not what happened in the asset management industry. This has not been a revolution. The revolution started in Europe in the asset management industry. I suppose a lot of money started to be treated as green in this sense in Europe, but this, unfortunately, from the local asset management perspective, as mine, has not yet transferred to Poland. Polish investment market is not yet developed in this sense as the European is for the moment. So I can develop later if you want to.
I mean, it's very interesting to talk about also the transition in the sense that, you know, we have the Western-owned banks in certain parts of the CE ecosystem. It's just what it is. But then also some banks that we've seen locally are very, very active, and we can talk about it, unpack it later in terms of what particular activities they're doing and what actually can yield 10 times bigger impact because the transition needs are bigger. So Piotr, since you've been observing this space for 15 years or more now, and now you have a slightly different hat from before, I would love to hear how you look at the whole risk landscape, because many years ago I worked in one of the biggest pension funds in Europe, and we were hired under one of the companies I used to run, a funny name, and what we needed to do was pretty much come in as devil's advocate. So we're the most unpopular people in the entire company. We actually caused some people to resign, which is a funny story, because we created a big conflict between the asset management, the investment department, and the risk management. But it was a very interesting exercise. It actually revamped the strategy, and it had direct impact. And I would like to hear your thoughts about this. So what we did is we suggested that for certain actors where change was possible, and I won't mention the sector because my clue which pension fund it is, but we actually argued that you need to put time frame and then certain KPIs. And every KPI not met gets questions first, then remuneration, and then investment cut. Or some sort of tweak, or like, you know, some sort of, you need to create either reputation risk or financial risk. And then all of a sudden, there will be change. And there was change. It took 3 years, but actually the entire strategy of this big company, which was a very big risk for them, changed. So do we see any kind of things like that happening also in the Polish market? Or is the conversation starting? Or is it already more advanced than I realize in some sectors? So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure, thank you. Perhaps it's now easier for me to talk about banking since I'm out, so I'm less constrained than I used to be. Well, you're asking effectively about what are the levers and what are the motivations for those institutions to actually introduce the change. So I think the change is actually happening, so that's the positive. I promised a few people that I would try to be a little bit more optimistic than usual. The change is happening, and the first lever is obviously regulatory. So what you are referring to was more internal need, but I think for Polish banks especially, I think the driver is more coming from the regulation. So taxonomy, SFDR that was mentioned on the investment side, this is actually pushing everybody to start doing something, which is okay, but this unfortunately is probably not enough, because what happens if you're only driven by regulation is this is more of a tick-the-box exercise, or unfortunately this is more of a reporting exercise, which is not really strategic. So I think in order to achieve what you are mentioning, you need something more, right? So I think the thing we are missing actually in most of the Polish but also CE region, banking sector but also the financial industry, is a little bit more strategic approach, when we are not only aiming to report, but actually we have a vision what we want to achieve. So that part is missing, and we need to find some tools and ways of developing them that will actually motivate the industry to change, because effectively our region is mostly banking driven, it's mostly banking financed in the end. So obviously together with Krzysztof, I'm now in the asset management, we'll try to improve on the investment side. There's a lot of works going on as well. But in the end, if those economies that we have here in the region are about to change, then we definitely need banks to move forward and probably drive, because effectively they invest in the economy, and if the economy doesn't change, then they'll just invest in what's available. So the whole issue of not having sufficient bankable projects is true, they are not there, but probably there needs to be a little bit of initiatives from the banks to try to develop, and maybe I'll elaborate on that a little bit later as well, not only renewable sector, but there are other sectors as well that need this kind of attitudes as well. So that's probably the first thing. You mentioned risk. I think, again, coming back to my point that most of the institutions look at this more from regulatory point of view or reporting point of view. I think not all of them really see this as a relevant risk element, right? So I think this kind of risk mindset is really required to really assess the full impact. So it's not only regulatory risk that we are facing, but there are other risks, and climate risk is one of them. So I wouldn't be kind of focusing purely on climate. I think we need to be a little bit more holistic, because otherwise, and I think it's easier to implement if this is looked at holistically. We are not pinpointing climate only, but we are looking at governance, reputation, social risks, and I think as a package, it goes down more easily. And maybe just to find my final point in this first intervention, I think what you mentioned was more like a negative motivation that you can put on people, like remuneration reductions, etc. I think what really works in banks, that's at least my impression, is if you also provide this positive motivation in a way that if you bring a deal that has a sustainability element linked to it, it's much easier to get it approved for one reason or the other. But if you put two similar or three similar projects on the table, and one of them has this connection, one way or the other, it is easier to get it through, because I think this is what really motivates people. If they are not only pushed to do something that they don't believe in, but if they get this positive aspect of actually, if I bring something that goes along this strategy, but then you have to have the strategy, obviously, that's the first point, it actually goes through. So I think this works better than perhaps, at least my impression, than putting this negative requirement on people and this deadline of report that we need to issue. And then ESG is the most hated acronym that is actually in the financial industry. And that's true, because it is seen as something imposed and as a very difficult task that nobody really understands what we are doing this for.
I just would like to add one more sentence to Piotr's one. Polish banks have already declared some specific targets, capital targets for green investment, for green loans. So I think they are behind already the decision making. Yes, some of them already declared 2 billion, 4 billion for green investments. So
but again, it's purely renewables. If you are,
of course,
if you are limiting to renewables, yes, the strategy is there. The question is, what's about the rest of the economy?
Those are the easy sectors.
Exactly. So the work
it's a first step, and that's great.
The work is before them, and maybe Erste's experience would help.
Yes, actually, let's turn to Erste before we return to Agnieszka. I mean, it's very interesting in the sense that we have several sectors that we discussed. Real estate is an issue. We really need to work on that more. Agriculture, we started the day with agriculture because we're in Poland. It's a big sector. If you look at Slovakia and Czech Republic, it's automotive. So we have different sectors with huge challenges and big investment needs, etc., and banking needs. So actually, if we talk about how to make the process easier, so currently we have an EU Life project that looks at SME certification under EU taxonomy. So bank gets a certificate, you know that the reporting is there, woohoo! So it makes your life easier. It's verified data, you just plug it in, done. We'll cross the bridge later when I can explain where the actual real-world issues are in engaging with SMEs and making them to actually accept this and do this, which is an interesting one. But what would that kind of thing, do we need certification? What do we need to actually make it faster and easier for banks to give the carrot rather than just the stick? And I would love to hear your thoughts, Gabriel, because I do think that there's a lot of untapped opportunities, whether it's certification, whether it's some sort of schemes that allow fast tracking. So what kind of carrots can we offer and how can we make it profitable? Because at the end of the day, we also need to make money. So it would be interesting to hear.
Very much true, and thank you very much for the question. I don't know whether the mic is working. Can you hear that? Perfect. So firstly, I think we have had just before the lunch a discussion about the SMEs, and that was the moment when, you know, I was relating very much back to the analysis what we did internally. And actually, you know, in this process of defining and building net zero targets, we recognize that specifically this region, you know, we are not speaking about the kind of OEMs like in the automotive, you know, the original engine manufacturers, but we are speaking about it mostly about the supply chain, right? And for that, you know, the methodologies does not exist. Those companies typically do not report at this moment. So very little data, very little kind of methodological support, even from those well-known standards like SBTI, as it has been mentioned. So over there, we definitely, you know, are facing a challenge of at this moment of the kind of the infrastructure which would support our understanding. So firstly, definitely some type of data. Some type of data would be definitely helpful. Secondly, also, you know, when we are speaking about these standards like PACTA, SBTI, they are focusing, you know, on the kind of mainstream sectors. But when you're speaking about the building construction, it's not enough to define a methodology for cement production, but concrete and building materials, you know, are producing, at least in our portfolios, kind of much bigger impact than financing the cement producer. Actually, if I take, you know, this sector, the cement producer related financed emissions are only 6% of the building material and the construction sector financed emissions. So, you know, a little bit different focus also from the standards, and of course a lot of academic research needs to happen. But ultimately what our approach was, let's do what we can do now. So where we do have methodologies available, automotive, cement production, steel production, oil and gas upstream sectors, and then the real estate, as I mentioned, and the energy power sectors, let's define for that quantitative targets, which are then translated in some way to business KPIs, not necessarily one-to-one, you know, financed emissions. We are not distributing financed emission budgets to our business colleagues. And for the rest, where we don't have this methodology developed, over there we at least try to apply some kind of qualitative targets. So how much of the portfolio we would like to motivate to build targets at all. And I need to say, I just looked up, you know, the Science-Based Target Initiative members, and Poland has 19 companies who are the, you know, committed and declared targets. Bravo, congratulations. I mean, Czech Republic has 2. You know, so you are light years ahead. I think it's very good. If the banking sector is, supporting it, rewarding it, then this will help to accelerate the process. And of course, what is coming, and we don't really know, is coming from the regulatory corner. Right? EBA this year in the working plan has, the capital charges. So we are very keen to see what kind of risk-weighted asset impact is going to come. As we have seen last year, the discussion paper from EBA, our understanding was that it will be another kind of brown penalizing factor and not a green relief factor, what we would love to see, because that would be something what also our customers would like to appreciate. But that will be definitely, one of the motivations. And also I need to reflect that the coal policy tracker, the website of Reclaim Finance, it's also a certain kind of motivation for the banks, and we were happy to adjust our coal policy as soon as we discovered this tracker. So yes, I mean, all this regulatory, push side, the society kind of demand, and I need to say also that we see from the customers the demand. Last year we were doing approximately 2.2 billion of green investments in the corporate lending side. I need to also add that this was 50% more than we expected. So we see that at least in the region of where we are operating, there are enough opportunities. We were happy to see that. And as we discussed, I think it was in some of the breaks, we are keen on to see how we can also engage with public sector on green financing, because there we see a lot of potential. We are convinced that the public sector, be it electricity grids, be it the waste collection and waste processing, be it the wastewater treatment, be it railways, be it the city commuting, urban infrastructure, everything might be very nicely, green or sustainable. We believe that the future investments are going into this direction, but it's very difficult to flag them because the reporting of taxonomy is at this moment not really covering this scope.
Well, thank you for bringing in the public sector. I think that's an absolutely crucial point, because actually during the day we had a few questions which we didn't get the privilege to answer. And several of them were, oh, it's all very nice, but we really need the Polish government to talk about ESG and sustainability more. It has that important, strange signal, right, that the markets know that this is a topic that the government stands behind. And we see that there's a lot of developments, and there will be a lot more actually next year and the end of this year in Hungary, because again, they want to spearhead the investment in energy efficiency via public-private partnerships, bond issuance, sustainability-linked instruments, and it's an ongoing dialogue. So everybody in the private sector knows that there's support, there's knowledge, go and ask, there will be an opportunity to structure these deals. So I think that's a very important point. And it's interesting that you mentioned that in Czech Republic we only have 2. Not great. Hopefully that will change in the next few years. We will keep pushing for that. At the summit we'll also have a special session on public-private partnerships with the government. There's some exciting news coming there in hopefully in the next few months. So I think that the opportunity is there, but again, it's also, I think it's a very interesting thing. When we started our very first event, we really struggled to engage the local stakeholders because they were very scared of talking about these things. Even the talking was a little bit terrifying, so I actually applaud that you mentioned the Reclaim Finance and the other things, because it's criticism, so all of a sudden people don't really want to talk about it in case they will be in public for attacked for not doing well enough. And I think that's another thing that we would like to push, that it is actually genuinely a process of improvement, and it's very bold to try and improve and admit that not everything's perfect, because there is a lot of knowledge in the system. And I think that's something that needs to happen a lot more, is these, if they need to be confidential, let's do confidential exchanges, but I do think that it's very important to show the carrots and connect the parts of the system and actually showcase the great examples that exist across the region. And Poland is doing some amazing things that I think don't always get the good PR, let's put it that way, not like Estonia with tech. Sorry, Gabriel?
No, I just wanted also to follow up on one thought. I need to encourage the colleagues from the banks here. Once we show to the management the reclaimed finance ranking categories, where we are, where the other banks are, I mean, it was amazing. Immediately they started to ask, okay, how we can go there, what we need to do there. The same we are doing with the ESG ratings, and I need to say that this kind of benchmarking, but not just on the top level where everybody is getting depressed, but on the individual categories, on the individual domains, this helps a lot. It pushed us toward the net zero. Now the next big topic for us is also the biodiversity, which we touched somewhere in the discussions, as I had recognized. But many of these things are coming simply from the competition, because like it or not, all of us has certain investor base. And in case of Erste, most of our institutional investors who we screen are part of climate engagement groups. So we need to deliver, on the expectations.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's always very interesting to see where the pressure comes from, and I think there's more and more pressure on the same topics from different parts of the system. Let me bring it back to you, Agnieszka. So you've been observing Poland, and you've created a master's course on sustainable finance, and you work together on a variety of topics. So I would just love to hear your thoughts. So we heard that the Polish government has a platform on sustainable finance, which is already fantastic. I mean, not every country has that. So what concrete actions would you actually suggest that the governments do across the region to encourage the development and make it easier for everyone also to get that data? Because when we did some research, a lot of data that we believe should be publicly available is actually behind closed doors, black wall. Then you have to apply for it, and then you potentially get one bit, and then you don't get the other, etc. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks so much for this. I'm taking the time because this is something that could last 15 minutes or longer. Just to be mindful so that we have also a time for a discussion. So I would start a little bit also by recognizing the steps that have been made and echoing what Piotr said, what you said also, that a lot of, if I compare the state of the ESG discussion in Poland today versus 2 years ago, this is like, wow. And of course, not all of it is really in depth. Not everyone has done a postgraduate diploma in sustainable finance or had a lot of practice in that area. But we are at a state of consciousness of the challenge now. So now we just have to understand the magnitude and go a little bit deeper into kind of these practical things. Now coming to the kind of recommendations, and this is building actually on work done with Visa Europa that is supporting the Polish platform on sustainable finance, and I have the pleasure of helping a little bit with that. I would say there are again 3 kind of areas of recommendations. So first, thinking in ecosystem of sustainable finance terms. Second, forward-looking guidance from supervisors. And 3, incentives on supply side and the demand side. So starting with the ecosystem of sustainable finance, I think it's really kind of, such a crucial lesson. The fact that Poland has issued the first sovereign green bonds has not led to development of this market. We really should reflect why this is the case, and why, if we have all of these different initiatives since decades now, this ESG market segment is still remaining marginal. And one of the reasons I think you can identify is this absence of a vibrant ecosystem which is founded on cooperation rather than competition. And so kind of thinking in terms of how we can engage the financial sector, non-financial companies, financial supervisors. This is something that is now happening with the platform on sustainable finance. Of course, with some constraints, for example, sectoral regulation, which we know continues to be a barrier in this space. Now, and there is actually a lot of evidence that thinking in these ecosystem terms really contributes. So a 2016 paper which looks at what drove France to be really the leader in sustainable finance points precisely to this, to kind of joint public-private partnerships, activities in the financial sector, but also the educational, civil society engagement, etc. Now, when it comes to concrete things that such Polish ecosystem of sustainable finance could look into on the basis of principle of cooperation are things like data, project pooling, and here Piotr has done some very interesting work proposing different types of pooling mechanisms, also for smaller to kind of get over the scale problem that we have in the market. So data pooling and engagement also for maybe types of investors that are not present in the market, such as women investors, for example, that we know have more of an ESG orientation. Now, when it comes to the kind of forward-looking guidance, and this speaks to something that Sean mentioned in his keynote speech, this is a period of uncertainty. So when I hear market participants calling for stable regulatory environment, I find it very difficult to react, because this is not, there is no way that this will be a stable regulatory right. Taxonomy, by definition, is going to shift the innovation frontier of greenness. We have a variety of movement on the regulatory sphere, from financial sector to real economy, Fit for 55, new banking package that is now being discussed in the context of the green supporting factor and brown penalizing factor. This won't be a stable regulatory environment. So how can we create some stability in this context? And I think there are two routes for public authorities to provide that. One is to lead by example, so really streamline sustainability transition through green budgeting, through providing access to data on greenness and public spending, like a green public procurement, something that came up as well. So really leading by example and giving like an anchor to private actors. And secondly, forward-looking guidance from supervisors, and ECB is one example of doing this, right? So providing a guide or a set of expectations, helping financial market participants navigate these challenges, and also make some strategic choices, such as whether, for example, ECB only looks at climate and environmental aspects in its guide towards the banking sector, but in Poland it might make more sense to look at the social aspects as well and integrate that and think in how this could work. So also kind of thinking, and this is something that I forgot to say in the context of the ecosystem, so building capacity here, but in a way that is anchored in European standards, international standards, also with view to prevent the types of problems that were identified in the context of the structure of the economy, right? So the fact that we are integrated in global value chains, and all of these transition plan requirements are not best suited for that purpose. And so a vibrant ecosystem spanning private, public, business, educational activities, forward guidance from supervisors with credible leading by example by public authorities. And thirdly, when it comes to incentives, we need to think about more both the supply side, so the availability of green projects, support for entities that want to invest in green but also want to transition, and through fiscal incentives, and also on the demand side. So a big problem in Poland is that the interest of investors in ESG is not really as high as it could be, and thinking in how to help financial investors, institutional investors, but also retail investors, for example, saving for their pension, really integrate these aspects, these sustainability aspects is really important. So these three.
Thank you. That's a brilliant overview. Especially, I love the leading by example. We recently organized a knowledge exchange. Yeah, I know, wishful thinking, but you know, we need to be wishful. We organized we have a technical assistance project for the Czech ministries on do no significant harm with DG reform, Trinomics. And I couldn't believe that these governments had never spoken about green budget tagging that Austria does. And everybody just loved it. super interesting. All of a sudden, it was bilateral calls left, right, and center. So the point is that even amongst governments, there's not very much knowledge sharing. So I think the best practices are very, very interesting because, of course, if you're overwhelmed, and some governments, sadly, I have to say, do have much less capacity. We saw that during Czech presidency. If you had 2 people working on 7 files in the Czech government, you had 45 working on 1 file in France. So the disparity between capacity also needs to be acknowledged, and we somehow need to tackle that across this region. So I think that's a good point. We actually have a lot of questions coming in. I should have probably looked at this earlier, so apologies about that. So I have 2 very interesting ones. So the pros and cons for climate capital charges and provisioning. I have another one asking, is it enough to focus on the trouble sectors, or is it more important to create all-encompassing databases covering all aspects and all sectors, which is taxonomy alignment? So what do we tackle first? Do we tackle the ones that we know have huge carbon emissions, etc., or do we need an overview of the entire economy? And is climate risk managed today more as an operational or as a credit risk? Which I think is a very interesting question because I can see different ways we could answer that. So I'll let Piotr take this one first, then we're going to go to Christoph, and then please everybody else jump in. And also if anybody has a question from the audience who are present here, just please raise your hand and we're going to get a microphone to you. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm glad somebody read the paper. So it was about pulling local authorities, municipalities, investments together, so they actually are more easy to finance in the market. So yeah, regarding climate risk, whether it's operational or credit risk, I think in general it's more seen as operational rather than credit, which I think is actually missing a large part of the risk there. And I think I can combine it a little bit with the question regarding the troubled sectors, because I think one word that everybody besides me mentioned, I think in their interventions so far, was transition. So if we are to tackle the real beast there, or the elephant in the room, we need to have a credible transition finance industry, sector, products, etc. This is the difficult part, because I mentioned, during the discussion with Christoph, renewables, everybody kind of already understands it makes sense to have at least part of the portfolio or the investments in renewables. The question is how much. But the difficulty is about all those other sectors that Gabriel mentioned as well. This is the transition part. So the issue that the industry, general financial industry and banks have, is that obviously regulations will change. So, it's very difficult to tackle what's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years, right? And when you are putting a loan on your book, it's rarely shorter than that, right? So you have to kind of aim for what's going to hit you in 3, 4, 5, 10 years, or if you're an insurance company or even pension funds, it can be even longer. So I think something we've seen in the asset management industry already quite strongly so far, and in banking sector as well in Western Europe, was that a lot of big institutions a little bit backed away because they went a little bit overly optimistic, and the intentions might not necessarily have been wrong, right? But it just happened. So I think now, if we are looking at more difficult sector or more difficult problem, which is transition finance, or tackling climate risk long term as well, you probably need a little bit stronger assurance that what you are doing is not going to hurt you, right? Because otherwise, the industry will focus on the low-hanging fruit or the low-risk fruit. So this is the risk management. You don't touch, the difficult parts at all. So I think I love the comment about the ecosystem. So ecosystem definitely will help this grow, but I think for the long-term investments in transition sectors, we need something stronger. Transition taxonomy would be a dream. Like, you really have, what the regulators, what the law is going to be about aiming for in the next years, because this is what taxonomy actually is. It tells you what is green and what is expected to be seen as green going forward, right? Which is great. Finally, we have some answers there. Transition is going to be much more difficult. Obviously, there will be a lot of work now done on transition plans, which will help to tackle the climate risk, all the aspects related to that. But the delta is the biggest there. So if we want to achieve, meaningful change, it needs to happen in those sectors. So some sort of proper, guidance is probably not enough. You probably need something stronger for really the industry to go into that meaningfully. So the dream would be to really have this sort of tool, this sort of vision of what's going to come in that space, and that should really change, move the needle, as the Brits say. So that would be my answer. Regarding climate risk, I think it's really about seeing this as a let's say, broad risk, right? I think if we look very specifically or just carbon, right? I mean, we have climate impacts that are not necessarily related to carbon. So this is a very wide topic, which I think we are currently just focusing on a very, very tiny part, or the large part, but not everything, right? We are looking at stranded assets as a risk, but there might be other impacts that we are not even recognizing yet fully, or not even starting to discuss yet. So I think it should be seen more and more as a credit risk, because I think the risk of some sort of big, let's say, drawbacks or need for writing down assets is not going to necessarily only come from the direction that everybody is looking at, which is potentially regulatory changes related to capital. And just shortly on pros and cons of capital. I think, as Gabriel mentioned, I think he nailed the point. The more you give the positive, the capital will flow there. Obviously, you don't want to finance the bad part, but you already have some sort of motivation, for example, even reputational, that is killing that. You do have a bit of reputational motivation to invest into the projects you really want to focus on, but in the end, unfortunately or fortunately, this is the reality. A lot of people decide with price. And if you can't offer a little bit of premium, it will not go there, right? This is the discussion I used to have a lot about, potentially issuing green bonds. 99% of potential issuers would ask, would it be cheaper for me? And the answer is probably not. So at least this is the case now. So if we can change that, that would be great.
So that's why we need some more stimulus probably on the government side or regulatory side to incentivize the issuance for the private sector. I don't mean also that we should forget about government bonds, because in Poland it's a shame a bit that we don't have green bonds. I would love to invest in green bonds of Polish government, but I cannot. This is the point. I have to invest abroad. We as a management company don't have a choice. We have to go abroad to Europe to invest into green products. But from the perspective of green bond private issuers, I think there could be an incentive created for, at least like in Asia. I think there is a subsidizing of costs of secondary opinion or other types of incentive, and maybe some incentive from the point of view of the demand. Yes, so the demand in Poland, at least for green product, is quite low. I feel it from the perspective of the retail clients, because they don't have the awareness of existing such a product, of such a possibility to vote by the investment to support the transition or some climate aspects. But I believe it will grow, because we have some research also on Polish investors. Especially the stock exchange investors are in 50% at least are aware of the ESG aspects, and they are eager to take them into consideration. At least 25% of them is already taking those aspects into consideration as probably risk factors. We have some also proven research that ESG higher rankings or higher scores can translate into potential premium in prices. So this is an example where we could also stimulate the growth of the market. Yes. So more or less from this angle, I would agree with Piotr about the risk perspective, because climate risk is a long-term story. For banks, it's more of probably it has more impact of resigning of the traditional approach of asset liability management, so matching the bonds duration with the loan book. But for us as an asset manager, it is a perspective of stranded asset. Yes, of the asset that is going to decrease in value from this year on in the future, and we don't know when. So it's a kind of black swan event. We have to take it into consideration and maybe some make some modeling about it. And that's why many asset managers prefer to make a negative screening and forget about certain sectors like fossil fuels, for example, not to have them included in the portfolio. Is the easiest way to make this approach of net zero that many declares to achieve in at least by 2050, and some of them declare to reach it by 2030. But it's very easy to decarbonize the portfolio of liquid assets like stocks and bonds. This can be done within a day. But it's much more problematic for a bank that has a large stock of loans and long duration of them. So this is something that is quite different challenge for banks and for asset management industry. Yes, but I would finally comment that we need some kind of governance both on the side of Minister of Finance and the Security Commission, and also some engagement in creating the green bond market, at least on the side of government bonds, because there is the market is not existing here in Poland for such a product.
Thank you, and I can see that Gabriel wants to come in, which is excellent. Please.
I will be very brief, but just something came into my mind as Krzysztof was speaking about. Let me give you a concrete example how we are, thinking and putting in practice our net zero transition targets, because that is answering, also the question on when the asset is becoming a strangled asset, right? So just, the energy is the very, very obvious one. Currently, as we disclose in a couple of days, but I think I can say it here, our starting point now of the financed energy sector is 420 kilograms per 1 megawatt hour. This is the measure where we are saying, okay, here we are now. Following a certain trajectory, making a modeling in our portfolio of financed assets, we expect to come by 2030 to 240 kilograms per megawatt hour financed capacity. So from 420 to 240. This seems to be kind of theoretical, but then comes a case when your business colleagues are coming that they would like to finance a gas-fired power plant. Gas-fired power plant which has 360 kilograms per megawatt hour. Today, this asset fits into your standards very well, but by 2025, you are reaching on your transition trajectory a point where this asset might start to become stranded asset in your portfolio. So you need to add additional renewable energy to create a mix which is still bringing you down then on the average financed assets into the level what you want to be. But I mean that's the reality. Also in the real estate sector, assets which today do fit to the standard, in 5-year times might just not meet the standard. So what we are trying to do is segregate the portfolio into 3 parts. Which are those assets which, at least in the next 8 to 10 years, are meeting already the future, standards, benchmarks? Which are those assets which do not meet the benchmarks, but can take additional investments? These are the business opportunities. The first was, the kind of golden treasures. Those ones we are just protecting that others are not refinancing. The middle part is the business opportunity, and then there is a 10 to 15% part which we already see that do not meet the standards, the future standards, and cannot take additional investments. You know, and this is what we are putting already today into intensive care, trying to find a solution or trying to refinance because not all the players are now still knowing the rule of the game. And just let me make the last comment. Last week I think ECB published a very interesting and valuable paper, and that was called Climate and Economy, in which I very much appreciated that ECB laid down, you know, their understanding how the climate is going to impact the economy through monetary, you know, side, but how it will impact also the financial sector, you know, the physical risks and the transitional risks. And there was one interesting point, and that was related, you know, what losses ECB expects in the banking sector going forward 30 years. And just, you know, two scenarios stick into my mind, and I think I need to mention it to you because you had many, you know, many leverage points on various parts of the public administration. In the next 30 years, in an orderly transition, ECB expects that the banks will suffer something like 3.5% loss of their assets. So that means on a yearly basis something like 10 basis points. In a hothouse scenario, so when we are doing nothing, they expect 8.5% loss of the banking assets, which is around, let's simplify it down, 30 basis points. So the difference between doing what we should do and doing nothing is 20 basis points of, you know, losses, credit losses, yeah, of the banks. And now, if we should think about the premium, isn't this 20 basis points, you know, what should go in some way into premium? And if we are speaking about 20 basis points on the whole portfolio, but green assets we have maximum 25%. So it can be very nicely coming to 100 basis points premium if the regulator, either through capital charge, because evidently we will have lower losses, so we will not need so much capital, or kind of state subsidy, because the state can, you know, donate all the future losses, give these 20 basis points or 100 basis points to the financial sector to channel it to the real economy, to support the green assets, green investments, and create all of that wave. We just need to reach a break point, and then it becomes to be sustainable. I don't know what is the opinion of the speakers.
Maybe shortly. Yeah, I think it's a very valid point. I think it touches upon what I was mentioning, that there are perhaps certain sectors where, and I'll come back to that in a second, where the market is driving the change. There will be others where there needs to be this additional financial motivation, right? And this is a great example of how potentially this could work to push, you know, institutions. The banks are driven by capital charges. This is the, you know, generally the way banking works. That's a secret, right? Capital, I think, decides where the money goes, right? This changes the returns massively. It's regardless of what the product is, you know, the cash flows will be fairly similar. If you change the capital charge, it's going to change. The banks will just move the money there because it will make sense. So that's, you know, in a short, I think you are, you know, fully right that this premium aspect is the motivation. This is what people ask you for, and if you give it to them, issuers, project, you know, creators, companies, etc., and banks on the other side, it will just happen. It's economics, right? There doesn't need to be additional motivation there. But I think one thing you also mentioned was, you as well, leading by example. I think there's also a need, you mentioned supply chains as well. If you are a big fish in a small tank, you probably have this role how to build the ecosystem, so that's very important to how to drive the change. And the last bit I wanted to mention, I think you should have also mentioned that, Gabriel, is that how did this develop, you know, the sustainable finance sector develop in Western Europe? It was mostly driven by institutional investors. So I have a good example in Poland. Like we do a lot of work at our asset management company at PZQ. We did a lot of work on screening our portfolios about what we have there, how we assess it from ESG perspective, etc., etc. And one sector that actually stood out was commercial real estate. And the reason for that was that if you want to rent somebody an office or a warehouse, now a lot of those companies will ask you to have a high certification standard, and there is a standard as well. And on top of that, if you want to refinance this or sell this asset, the international investor community will definitely come and ask for that. So by rule, this sector in Poland is going in the right direction simply because the market is driving it, right? But obviously, there will be a lot of other sectors when this doesn't happen, unfortunately. And one of the reasons is simply we don't have international institutional investors present. So Polish retail market is an example. Polish retail market is not yet driving this change. At some point it might. But I think if we have this mindset kind of institutional international investors might enter this sphere at some point, they will ask for it. Then you have this vision of actually going that direction, because in 3-4 years' time, it will be easier to refinance it, sell it, whatever you want to do with it, if you are able also to sell it to an international player.
Yeah, thank you. Christoph?
Just one more additional comment. We have an excellent example of ECB acting as a guidance, declaring of buying the portfolio, refinancing the portfolio of their bonds buying as corporate bonds, I assume, but from the companies that have they will overcome the special hurdles on ESG scores. So they are forcing them to improve, yes, and this is a way we can influence the market, yes.
For the Polish central bank to get into that space, although they've done like assessment of fossil fuel exposures in the banking sector in the financial stability review in 2021, but that is the only time you'll find the Polish central bank actively exploring this issue. I wanted to come back a little bit to this green supporting factor, brown penalizing factor question. I absolutely love it. I make students in Warsaw and in Frankfurt discuss it, and you get really interesting results from them. If you test before, then have them discuss and make a little quiz again. They start from green supporting factor is a fantastic idea. They end up in a different point. And I think it's also, so this is something that is now really being discussed by regulators. This year or next year, we will have a new piece of regulation in the banking sphere, which will either introduce one or the other. So a very timely topic, and I think it helps really see this tension between a single financial materiality perspective and the double materiality perspective, right? So if the brown penalizing factor seems like the most obvious risk perspective, right? But it's only when you dig a little bit deeper that the green supporting factor starts to make sense. The problem is that the supporting factors, so these political corrections of the microprudential framework that we've introduced, like SME supporting factor or infrastructure supporting factor, so far have not really brought the results that were intended, especially for the SME supporting factor. So the question is exactly what other types of incentives from supervisors are needed. And I think what is really important also to recognize or remember is that there is already space in existing prudential rules to take this into account. In December last year, Basel Committee published frequently asked questions on including from a single financial materiality perspective, but nonetheless climate-related risks in whether the standardized approach or the internal ratings-based approach. So there it's already possible to include these factors in the framework. And then you have different supervisors using the discretion that they already have. And Hungary is a really interesting example. You can of course discuss like endlessly accountability-related issues and institutional quality, etc. But within Pillar 2, they created a discount for certain energy-efficient mortgages that leapfrogged the market there, right? So in some contexts, especially when the market is really underdeveloped, there is already space for supervisors to do this.
Just shortly, 2 sentences.
think it has to be the mix of both. But what is actually more appealing in the green supporting factor, which obviously the industry would love more, is that you can introduce it immediately, as you mentioned. If you want to introduce the brown penalizing factor, you have to do it like in a few years' time, because otherwise you're actually, you know, hitting the industry that is actually having a bit of issues, especially on the capital side. It's not only in CE, it's across actually Europe, US, and other places in the world. So if you don't want to hit financial stability, perhaps you can immediately introduce the green supporting factor and at some point also start introducing the brown penalizing factor. So I think if you want to have a change quickly, that would do it, right? The other part is more difficult to introduce.
Thank you, Gabriel. I can see that you grabbed the mic as well. Please.
Yes, I was just thinking whether I still do have my thoughts. I would, you know, still like to come back to the point of the public policy and you know, how effectively it can work. Yeah, and I think that we can see very good examples, and I need to say that I was living that time in Czech Republic back at early 2000, and that time the Czech government made an excellent model of how to, you know, accelerate the mortgage market. And they made it in a very kind of good way, you know, incentivizing the interest rates. Whereby we have seen in other markets, and let not name them, where we have seen, you know, general portfolio guarantees given to the financial institutions, and suddenly, you know, the whole mortgage market went into a completely different direction, right? So what I want to say is that public policy and public incentive measures can make a very big boost into the market if they are applied on the right way, at the right time, to a right discriminatory measure, right? If you are applying them just, you know, too late or too indiscriminatory, you will have no effects. Yeah? And I know the example of the SME supporting factor on the capital. I think over there, the issue might be is that it's not discriminatory enough. Between one segment to apply to everybody basically the same factor is just not really helping. Yeah? And this can be completely differently balanced between the green and the brown, you know, activities in the economy.
Thank you. On that note, actually, we have run out of time, and I mean, let's hope we don't run out of time tackling climate change, because this is an ongoing issue. So the underlying problem that we're trying to, I guess, address is the fact that we don't have that much time until 2050. At least that's the kind of big number that we have set ourselves, arbitrarily maybe, but that's what we've done with the climate goals. And the point is, there's so many different ways we can get there. More disruptive, as you pointed out, or less disruptive, more arduously or less, but one way or another, we will have to tackle these issues. And I think the longer that we delay, whether we experiment with supporting factor or penalizing factor, I think one of the things that we discussed at the Banca d'Italia conference last week in Italy was that, well, one of the key things is to start doing things and start with smaller tweaks, see how the system reacts, and then maybe readjust. Nothing needs to be set in stone if you can see it's not working. We do have options also to change policy at some point, but the point not doing anything is not an option because the risk keeps building into the system. And I think that's the kind of key thing that we have discussed here as well, that there's many different ways how we can do it, but the key thing is that the public authorities that actually hold a lot of the market-making power have great responsibility to be a bit more forward-looking and active, and maybe show a bit more thought leadership so that the market can function a bit better in terms of also reaching the 2050 goals. On that note, thank you everybody for joining us and persisting throughout the day. For those who joined from 8:30 a.m., we actually think the first person arrived at 10 past 8 a.m., so they've done very well. We have some drinks and nibbles, etc. At the room next door. So thank you very much for joining, and we will share the photos and videos probably already tonight or tomorrow. So thank you everybody.